So this workshop is the first of its kind. We're still figuring out the most effective way to do this. And in the future, if this is interesting, we might involve more people. We might be able to involve the iNet video team. So many of you know that iNet has actually had a huge reach on YouTube. And I know that the person who's been in charge of that might be able to pop in for one of these workshops and help us out. Similarly, iNet involves journalists. So Lynn Paramore, if you ever read her work on the iNet blog, she also knows how to speak to the news. So I'm hoping that in a future iteration of this, she might be able to come in. So this is, I guess, the first of more. I'm hoping it'll be the simplest version for now. And the structure for today will be quite simple. We'll have part one, part two, and a break in the middle. So part one, we're gonna just talk about why is this even relevant in the first place, and what are you gonna, potentially get out of putting yourself through the awkwardness of speaking to the lens. What to expect if you give it a try, and how to structure your message. So that'll be the next, 40 minutes for right now. Then we'll take a little break, a break of also roughly 40 minutes. So you can, get a cup of coffee, but we also hope that you will actually sit down and draft a little working script or some bullet points for what you want your message to be, just on a first little video that you might want to make. You can, do that off screen. If you get stuck, I'm going to be here on the Zoom, so you can come back and we can coach you through it. But we have all the faith in you that you'll come up with something that we can work with in that break. Then part two is going to be a little bit about how to set yourself up for an effective delivery, right? Without needing, all sorts of tripods and things. A few notes on how to edit, and a couple points on sharing your content. And Manuel will also talk to us in this part about his experience trying all this as a young scholar, kind of for the first time. So that should set you up essentially to, after all that, go give it a shot yourself. So hopefully by the end of part two, you'll feel confident enough that you want to give it a go. And if you are in a time zone where it's the end of your day, maybe you need to wait until the morning, but hopefully you can reasonably soon after the workshop give it a try. And if you're willing, you can throw the result into a private Discord chat with the rest of this group, and we can give you a bit of feedback, a bit of encouragement, if you would find that helpful. Because definitely the first few times it's going to feel a little funny, and we're just here to support you, so we hope that you make use of that. Alrighty. So why video, right? Why do this at all? If you are an academic, chances are your advisor is not encouraging you to, put a version of your thesis on TikTok. Chances are it's not part of your workflow. You already have a really busy schedule. Maybe you're teaching. It can be a lot to kind of maneuver. But there are some interesting benefits, and in YSI we always like to experiment with new things and see what comes out. So I'm just going to throw out for you, a few things that you might get out of this. First of all, not to be underestimated, is actually the ability to explain what you work on, right? A lot of academics, especially when they speak to each other, they use some really intense words. They use a lot of jargon. They use a lot of technical language. And although there's a time and a place for that to really get into the nitty gritty, it can be super, super valuable to be able to explain your work in a way that almost anybody can understand it and can see what the point of it is, right? Can see why it's relevant that you're working on that, and why the issues that you are curious about are important in the world today. because it opens doors. Honestly, when people know what you're working on and have some sense of why you're doing that and why it's important, they're going to put in opportunities in front of you and invite you for a panel or remember to call you when there's a job opening. So just that is actually massive. Um, Related to that point is that it kind of forces you to reconnect with the essence of what you're working on, right? Because if you challenge yourself to speak about the work that you do in like the work you do in all its complexity and nuance and scope and breadth, right? If you challenge yourself to pull out 1 minute long statements from that, like, or 1 minute long insights from that, it really kind of pushes your brain to figure out what is the crux here. What is like the piece of it that almost anybody would agree is important or matters. Um, and it takes practice to do this, honestly. Like a lot of the time it's easier to present a paper than to say in 1 minute like why that paper matters. So if you find it hard, that's normal. But that doesn't mean it's not useful. It's super, super useful. Okay, bullet number three, it prepares you for teaching and public speaking, right? We've had other workshops in YSI about teaching in particular, and it's actually very common for young scholars to say that this is one of the more challenging things to being a young scholar, being in the kind of the early career stages of research and academia, because very few people teach you how to do it, right? They don't sit you down for a whole course on pedagogy and communication skills. And so getting yourself out there and kind of forcing yourself to practice putting your work into words for somebody who doesn't yet know all the concepts that you do, it just again like it opens up that section of your brain that you weren't weren't yet using, and it starts firing all sorts of connections to help you get that moving. I kind of already mentioned bullet number four in terms of presentation and collaboration opportunities, but just to hit it home, in order for people to invite you and collaborate with you, they need to know you exist, right? And they need to know what you're interested in. And this applies also to YSI. So we are actually excited to see if we can use some of this energy to make young scholars more visible to each other within the community. Because if it's easy to see, a few 1 minute video clips on, say, Nandu. I see Nandu joined the call. Hey, Nandu. He actually already shot a video clip recently. Once you see a few of these videos, you immediately have a picture in your head of who this person is. You see that they are friendly, and you see what they're working on and what they're interested in, and it might spark an idea to start a project together or co-author a paper down the line. You really don't know, I guess, what's going to come out of putting yourself out there until you do it, and then it'll still surprise you. Um, oh, I see another comment in the chat. Nando also recently won a contest in presenting your thesis in 3 minutes. Congrats, Nando! Yay, that's really cool. So maybe at the end, after Manuel shares his experience, we could also briefly hear about that because that seems like relevant expertise. All right. Last point on this slide: grow your impact and following. Right. This obviously doesn't happen overnight. It's not like if you throw 3 videos on X or Twitter or whatever that suddenly you're gonna have changed the world. But if you find that this is fun for you and it's interesting and it's a good exercise and you're learning something and some stuff is coming out and you invest some time, you make it a routine, you start thinking about it kind of more systematically and figuring out what kind of an audience is interested in the expertise that you have, a lot of stuff can happen. So I have 2 examples of people who've taken this quite far in the field of economics. One of them is this guy, Gary. I have actually got a typo here. It's Gary's Economics, not Gary Economics. He's a British guy, used to work in finance, like in the city of London as a as a banker of some sort. But while he was doing that, realized how concerning the increasing wealth inequality actually looked and started digging into that a whole bunch. And then he began sharing to social media his theories about what this is going to do to society, what this means for people on the ground, why both rich and poor should care, what policy should do about it. And he's built a massive following on this. So I don't know if I can properly share. I'm just gonna try for one little second. Here, at least you can see his face. You can see he's got 500,000 followers just on Instagram, right? And he's on other platforms too. He's got a book now. And these are just little clips where he's talking about the problems as he observes them with his expertise. I think it's a little bit hard to like fully show you something right now, but we can even use the break for this if you'd like to get into that a little bit more. All right, second person that I wanted to highlight in this realm is a little bit different. I'm just gonna go back to my slide. Here we go. Her name is Kyla Scan something. Kyla Scan. She's a woman in the United States, and I think she's a little bit younger than Gary's economics. She speaks specifically about current events and tries to make them super easy to understand for young people. So her audience is really people who are not in the field of economics. They don't know what's going on when they look at the news. They are kind of stressed out about it. And so she'll start her videos a lot of the time by simply saying, so the federal government in the US just did XYZ, right? So Trump just imposed a bunch of tariffs. So this just happened. So the stock market just crashed. And she'll, in very kind of relaxed language with little doodles on a whiteboard sometimes, kind of go through and point out what that means for people in their life, or why it matters, or what is something that you can kind of understand if you didn't already. So those two are interesting. If you hadn't heard about them yet, definitely like take a look. It is kind of inspiring to see how much success they've had. And again, like we're not we're not gonna get there tomorrow, right? But it's just kind of cool to see what happens if you maybe put a year of time towards something like this. You could probably be a lot further in your reach than you might realize. So that's to get you excited. Then just to, I guess, throw a word of caution, a word of reality. Obviously, there's a lot of excitement, but there's also a few things to watch out for when you get into this, right? Maybe this is obvious, but it's still worth stating. Videos live forever because even if you can take them down if you decide you don't like them anymore, um, they may already be out there. Obviously, if you are just beginning, it's likely that you won't get a lot of like circulation. It's not necessarily that other people are going to start sharing your things and screenshotting them and storing them on Dropbox or whatever, but it's just a good rule of thumb to remember that what you put out there is part of, I guess, your face, your online presence, and somebody who wants to hire you in the future may see it. That doesn't mean you should self-censor, right? Like all for openly speaking your mind, but it just might inform how you frame something. So in my personal opinion, for example, um, coming up with a positive message, like if you see a lot of things go wrong in the world, turning that around and saying the direction in which we could go instead can be a lot more productive than saying like this person's evil, this is what where everything is going downhill. um, Even if there are cases where it might make sense to believe that, it can be more strategic to kind of frame things in a forward looking direction. So that's just a subjective statement, but it's useful to keep in the back of your head. And then there are some things to kind of like, I guess, prepare your brain for. If you decide to start posting regularly online, it's only a matter of time I guess for people to kind of disagree and dislike your content in some way, right? And I think there are probably three ways in which you can easily get upset. The first is simply if somebody disagrees and you just feel a little insecure, right? Like I've certainly been there when I feel like I've made a statement, I really believed in it, and then somebody just kind of tells me that I'm wrong. Um, in that case, it is a learning opportunity. You want to actually be confronted. You want feedback. You want to hear where maybe your logic had holes in it, and it's just a little bit. It just feels a little bit weirder when you get the feedback from a total stranger out on the internet versus like your friend or colleague or advisor in a classroom during a conference. Um, but assuming that the person is making a, a reasonable constructive of some sort piece of feedback is actually it's actually beneficial. You can learn from it, you can discuss with them. However, very important to distinguish this from comments that are simply rude and useless. Okay. um I do think there's a downward trend on this. Like I've heard different um I don't know, online personalities talk about this and say that it seems to be on the decline. Like people are getting a little tired of the whole anonymous trolling and being just straight up rude for the sake of venting or whatever. It's on the decline, but it still happens. And you just wanna best you can um try to emotionally distance yourself from it, right? So there's a way I think like when you're working really hard at your computer and your eyes are just like in the screen and everything just feels like really zoomed in, you want to do the opposite where you're kind of like loosely relating to the stuff on the screen. A rude comment comes in, it's like a little cloud that flies by. You have a little bit of space, mental space between you and this thing, because it is it is just useless if somebody is being plain rude. um and and chances are your content had nothing to do with them, wasn't intended for them, and it's just completely irrelevant. So it says a lot more about that person than it says about your work at that point. And everybody goes through that to some degree, so don't take it personally, I guess, is the other item. Um, Third, and that can be equally upsetting, is when it feels like you're speaking to a void. Low engagement is really normal at the beginning, okay? Uh, People don't know that you're posting, they don't expect you to post, so they're not like looking for it. Um they may not, register that there's a useful perspective on their feed. Um, and it's fine. It can actually be a good thing because when you first do this, it takes time to kind of own the craft, right? It takes time to kind of get comfortable speaking to the camera, to get comfortable distilling your points. You need several rounds of practice to figure out the best way to open a video, how to use your voice, how to close a video, what kind of language goes in the copy, what kind of language goes in the bio. All these things have an impact. And for sure, the first like 7, 8 times, one of those items aren't going to be great, and as a result, maybe your video is not going to like hit it out of the park, right? But that's okay, because if you're getting low engagement in the beginning, it actually gives you room to fail, right? You don't have to feel like you're up in front of a million faces right away. You get to feel like you're up in front of like three friends or this group, um, and let it feel more safe that way. So use it, I guess, to your in a mindset way. Use it to your advantage. When you're not getting a lot of views in the beginning, it gives you room to practice and get better, so that by the time you get a lot of views, you are actually good at this thing. Okay. So, well, one more point on this slide. The main thing is just to give yourself a chance to practice and to learn, right? Like give yourself room to experiment and let YSI support you, because this is the other thing that's still in early stages, but it is coming down the pipe. We might be in a position where we can actually like pull your content and highlight it on the INET website or highlight it on YSI's websites and channels, um, in a way that can boost you and boost your profile and boost your potential as an online presence. So if you go through a bit of practice and you realize that this is fun for you, you want to do more of it, it's feeling exciting, just lean into it and let us see if we can give you a bit of extra push out there and see if we can speed up your growth. All right, so that was a bunch of intro on why to do this, some examples, what to watch out for. Now let's spend a bit of time on how to actually structure your content, right? And this is maybe actually the most tricky part of it all, because there's honestly a million different ways to do it. In the end, you want to find a way that feels natural to you or exciting to you or fitting to your work. But there are a few, I guess, like guiding lights here, like a few frames that you can use if you're new, if you're trying to figure it out and try some stuff. Tip number one is to focus on one main point, right? The human brain can only think about one thing at a time. No matter how hard we try to multitask and hold different ideas in our head, it's really just one thing at a time. So if you want people to actually walk away remembering what you said, say one thing at a time. You can make 30 videos and say 30 different things. It's going to be more effective than making 10 videos that say 3 things each, right? So when it comes to scripting, however you do it, just try to make one point and illustrate it well. Repeat it at the beginning and at the end, and let it really sink in with whoever's watching. Now, a few frames that you can consider are, I guess, these 3. Like I said, there's many more, but these are 3 that you could experiment with for the purpose of this workshop or just because you're beginning. Number 1, an interesting research finding, right? This is a good one, I think, if you are worried about not wanting to dumb down your work, because I hear that a lot from academics. Like, they don't want to do social media because on social media you have to make everything sound like a newspaper headline on the Daily Mail, and that's just an insult to their years of combing through nuances and parsing apart data. If you don't, if that's how you feel, or that's part of your thinking, it can really help to allow yourself to zoom in on one specific piece of data that you ran into in your work. Could be, data that your analysis revealed, or simply data that you see out there. It doesn't really matter. Maybe it's data that you read in the Wall Street Journal yesterday, and because you, as an economist, have a lot of other ideas that you can connect it to in your head, you can notice that this is actually interesting or relevant, and you can bring it to people with that extra perspective and help them see it in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. So you can even do this thing where you have like the graph up above your head, and your little face is in the corner. That also helps if you don't like your face being big on the screen. That can feel awkward. And you can talk about the graph and what it means, right? Because random data points, like, for example, how young the population is in sub-Saharan Africa. Sometimes I see these graphs of like the average age is like 17 or something, right? That is a super small statistic, and you could see it on a chart. Maybe it's something you come across in the newspaper. As an economist, you can talk about what that means for labor markets, what that means for people's retirement, what that means for migration, what that means for all sorts of things. And if you go through a few of those bullet points and basically hit home the message of pay attention to this is important, a lot of people online can walk away with it and be like, oh, hey, I should keep that in mind when I, start my new startup, or I should keep that in mind when I try to understand what's going on in Kenyan politics or whatever it is. Um, you'd be surprised, I guess, how much you can pull out from one piece of data without dumbing things down. Okay, number 2, thoughts on a current issue. Um, plenty of current issues to go around these days, right? So one thing that I think is useful to keep in mind here is that there's obviously already a lot of talk around things going wrong in the world, stuff being a mess. Look, you open the news and you're like appalled every single day, over and over and over again. I think there is a vacuum where you can add something if you can say, hey, here's an issue, and here's a new way to think about it in the sense that it highlights, I guess, a positive alternative of some sort to what's going on. So maybe it's like, there's a scary sort of right wing rise up, and migration is becoming this hot topic. Maybe you know of a place, maybe your hometown, maybe your institution, wherever, where there's something positive happening in the direction that you find hopeful. You could connect those two and say, hey, the dominant narrative seems to be this, but are you guys aware this is also happening? Maybe it has potential. Let me know in the comments what you think, if this is something you've heard of before, or if you recognize it as useful. I think this is a little bit more, it can be a little bit more difficult to do because you're making more of a point rather than simply like pointing to something and encouraging people to look at it. So it can be a bit more of a challenge, but if you do it well, you're initiating, I guess, a whole new way of thinking for people that can spiral and trickle over into further discussion, further ideas. Sort of similar is the third one, of an overlooked idea or solution. I put it in there to distinguish it from the second, as like, you don't necessarily need to relate it back to what's in the news, right? What's in the news is always going to be shared more, clicked more, liked more, etc. on feeds, because that's where people's attention currently is. So bullet number 2 kind of like meets people where they are more, but that doesn't mean that bullet number 3 isn't useful, because it can be very inspiring and exciting to share things that like just aren't getting enough coverage, and basically present them as, hey, here's something nobody's talking about that you should really know if you're interested in XYZ, right? I think we had one young scholar recently, Natasia, who was like, hey, nobody's talking about UBI anymore. Let's bring this back to the forefront because it's relevant now for these and these reasons. Those kind of conversations are fun because you get to say like, I have information that you all were overlooking, and you get to kind of like make that hook. So those are just 3 items. Like I said, the woman that we saw before, Kyla, she does maybe a 4th one that is simply explaining what's going on. So you could consider that too if you see something in the news and you feel like you could explain it to your grandmother, even though your grandmother never studied economics. You could start by saying, so this happened, here's how to understand it, here's what it means, or here's what a lot of people don't realize about it. Okay, so those are some frameworks. Now, when it comes to, I guess, getting your message prepared, you can do 2 things. The first is to simply write bullets and let yourself freestyle. Sometimes that works best because you aren't, overthinking your words. You're not going to be so stiff. Like, that's kind of what I'm doing now in this talk. I didn't script everything. I wrote some bullets and now I'm kind of just like blowing. But it has a downside because you can start rambling, which I often do. You may end up using way too many words to explain something. The video gets too long. Things just feel a little bit like all over the place sometimes. That's what happens to me. So there's a second approach, which is to actually script it out. scripting it out would mean writing it down word by word. That way you can also cut the length to, I would suggest, 130 words. That's about a 1 minute video. That allows you to really figure out the exact order in which you want to say things, the exact points you want to make, the exact words you want to use, because all this matters, right? If you're scrolling down TikTok, it really makes a difference if somebody gets right to the point versus they kind of have a slow introduction, and let you, kind of your brain needs to sort of catch up to why you're listening in the first place. So I think scripting can be really useful, but just like bulleting, it has a downside, because you can start sounding kind of stiff. If you script in a way that you would write, you will start sounding way too formal and way too rehearsed in a way. That just happens. So I think if you choose to script, a useful technique can be to write it down, then say it, then change the words to make it feel more natural to say it. Then do that again and go through like a few rounds of, I guess, like changing your written language into language you would use to actually like talk to a friend, right? In the end, you want to be speaking as close to a natural conversation as possible, even if you're talking about data or, quite, I guess, technical points. You ideally you're able to express them in a way that is easy to digest and easy to understand for somebody who hasn't done the same technical analysis. So you can try both. Obviously, you can try bullets and see what happens if you kind of freestyle and then watch the video back and be like, oh, okay, actually I did pretty good. Or I see that I'm rambling and it takes way too long to get the point across. Then you can always switch gears to scripting and write it out word by word and see what happens that way. No matter what, though, you want to do your best to try to avoid jargon. And there's some cool tools for this. I meant to put a link here, but I didn't. But you can do it several different ways. There's something called the Hemingway app or the Hemingway website, because Hemingway was this author who wrote in very plain language, and you can put a paragraph in there and tell it like to, make everything simpler, and it just fixes the language for you. Of course, at that point, it's gonna have picked words that you didn't pick, right? So you might need to go through another iteration of fixing it so that it feels like something you would actually say. But it can be very useful. Same thing, ChatGPT, right? ChatGPT is a weird tool, but it's pretty good at things like this of kind of taking the complexities out and making a suggestion for how to simplify what you mean to say. It's a suggestion, right? You need to use your gut and your smarts and your actual human brain to reconnect it to something that feels real. But it can just be a useful input in that exercise of really getting your points clear. Okay, what else do I have? I think I have opening and closing. So this will be our last
Just
item before we go. Yeah, Manuel.
Yeah, just one thing. Can you go back to the last slide? I mean, something of a personal experience. I would say that also maybe you can be lucky enough to, if you have an interesting finding, like long, long time ago, you can actually like that finding can be popular again because the topic is now booming. That happened to one of my thesis supervisors. He was an expert on inflation when nobody was talking about inflation. Then came the pandemics, and boom, the guy had a lot of interviews. And I think that if he would have trained a little bit more in front of the camera, he would have like more recognition. I mean, he had it, of course, because he was doing something nice, but also like keep your findings, all findings there, because 2 points of interesting research findings and current issues can combine in a point or will combine. And as you said, just to reinforce this point of don't think that your findings are not interesting. I think it's very important that to know that whatever we have put some effort on, it might be very interesting for another person in the world. And I think that's very, very important, because like you can think that you're talking with three people, but you're actually, there's a lot more people that it's that this finding will be insightful, and of course they will follow you. Yeah, just to add on a little bit on that.
For sure. Thank you. Yeah, I think that last point is really big, actually. It can be a big revelation to realize that very few people know the things you know. Um, because we all have this tendency to kind of assume that everybody else's brain is just like our brain, and they so are not. So it can be a big aha to put something that you think is so super obvious or not that interesting or not that deep. And a lot of people are like, "Oh wow, never thought about that before. I can really use that." Huh. And that's really fun when you get the hang of it. Okay, so just a couple of things on opening and closing, because those are important moments for any piece of content. Opening, obviously, is going to determine whether or not somebody sticks around to listen to the other, 57 seconds of what you have to say. So it's important. There are a lot of social media people out there that stress that you need a hook. Hooks can be a little bit, tacky or a little bit lame. You want to find a way in which it still feels natural, but it does kind of create that spark for a second so that somebody stops their scroll. So just a very few simple examples in this context, right? You can say, here's one thing that few people understand about XYZ. Let's talk about ABC. Or what I already said earlier, so this happened. Here's what it means. That's very different from starting with, "Hi, I'm this person. I'm the coordinator of this working group, and I think that we should start talking about this kind of thing because it really matters." Then it takes 10 seconds to get to the to the meat of it, I guess. And even though it's important for the user to know who you are and what kind of your credibility is as an online presence, that stuff can go in the bio, right? Or it can come at the end, or it can come in the middle, where you're like, in my role as such and such, I've figured out that this is relevant. But the very first sentence, let it be something kind of punchy. Then in the closing, it's good to remember that ultimately it's a conversation, right? Saying something online can feel like you're saying something to just this, I guess, like herd of people, and you're just trying to sound like reasonable, and you don't expect them to, I guess, respond the way a normal person would. But it helps to remember um, that in the end, it's just a different manifestation of a conversation. So imagine that you're talking to one person instead of talking to 1,000. If you're talking to one person, you also would want to hear their perspective at the end. You'd make a point and then you check if they understood you, or you would say, you would try to figure out if they want to hear more from you, or you would try to see if they have a different point of view on the same thing. So it can be helpful in the closing to say something like, let me know what you think. Like, I'm curious if you are observing the same thing that I just talked about. Maybe in your region of the world, things are very different. Put it in the comments. And the more you can, I guess, create a targeted action for them to take, like a specific action for them to take, the more likely they are to take it, right? If you tell them to do 3 different things, they're going to have to decide between those 3, and they're probably going to do none. If you tell them to do one thing, like give give their perspective on one piece of your statement in the comments, they're more likely to do it. And obviously you can encourage them to follow for more. You can say that in a way that isn't so cringy, by kind of being like, if this is interesting to you, I'm going to be talking about more of these things. As stuff progresses, like we'll have more content like this. If it's fun for you, follow along. You'll be updated as we go. So those are worth adding in at the beginning and at the end. Okay. I think that's about all I had. So for this first portion, we are on schedule to take our 45-minute break.